Tutorial time! Let's go ahead and make some fantastic bouncy ears for this lovely little fursuit head. So the first thing you're going to need to do is make yourself a pattern. In the case here, I just have a paper pattern that's lined up with the end of my cheeks and sits at the top of the eyebrows. Once you're relatively happy with the overall shape that you have, you're then ready to transfer that pattern onto foam. Make sure you check it from both the front and the side. I personally like to use the 1-inch foam for this because it's readily available and works pretty well. Once you have the shape cut out, the biggest thing we need to do is bevel the edge here. So you just take your scissors at an angle and cut and carve that so it's not a solid block of foam and it has a more natural shape, but we're not quite done with it just yet. The next thing that you're going to need to do is build up a bit of a support layer on the back of the ear. I like to use 1/2-inch high density foam for this. Cut out a piece that roughly matches this. You don't want it to go all the way to the end, just the base of the ear. Make sure you glue it down, and then just as before, you want it to look seamless and smooth, so go ahead and bevel those edges. Once the edges are beveled, you can see what a difference that makes, and it's already starting to look a lot more like an ear. To make it more wiggly, we're going to make a couple relief cuts in the foam so that it's not quite as rigid. I like to do this using a box cutter and just making about a 1/2-inch incision all the way down each part of the foam. You don't want to get too many of them, just a couple to kind of break up the shape and make the foam a little bit more wiggly. Next, we're going to add a little bit of weight and more spring to the ear by taking a piece of 1-inch elastic and just hot gluing this to the back of the ear. Make sure you press it down firmly and let it dry completely before you move on to the next step. Once the elastic is fully glued and set, you can see that the ear already has a pretty decent amount of wiggle to it, but we're not quite finished. We're going to take our scissors and bevel the edge that's actually going to connect to the head so that it sits at the correct angle. And then we're going to hot glue it to the head. Now this part is something really important that I've learned through trial and error. You only want to glue the very top and the very bottom parts. See here? You don't want to have the glue go all the way through the middle, otherwise it will reduce the amount of wiggle that the ear has significantly. Leave this area open. And on the very top and the very bottom, we are going to glue one part to the ear and one part to the head. You should see that there's a big gap between the two of these where that bevel in the foam is. Pull the ear into position until it sits right about in line with the ear, and then hot glue just this portion here down. We're also going to repeat that same step with the front of the ear and this little piece of elastic here. It doesn't need to be super long, and you want to try and make sure that you leave that space right where the connector of the ear is. This is what's going to allow this ear to remain super duper bouncy. With these pieces of elastic in place, we're now ready to move on to shaping the ear a little bit further. To do this, I like to take a piece of 1/2-inch high density upholstery foam, and I'm just going to make a little triangular shape like this that attaches to the top half of the ear and gives it a little bit more depth. You want to try and keep these as thin as possible because they're going to get very thick when they're finished. As you can see, it has a pretty good amount of spring in it, but we can make it even springier by making a couple more little relief cuts. I'm only making a couple minor incisions near the edges of the ears because I really want them to wiggle a lot. Go all the way along the top and the bottom, just making a couple small snips in the foam. Once these snips are there, the ear will automatically have a much more significant wiggle, but it still remains rigid enough that it'll spring back to the position it's supposed to be in. You can see how well the ears wiggle even when the base is firmly on the head here. Pretty cool, huh? Give that head a test fit and see how well those ears wiggle. Here you can see these ones wiggle pretty darn well, and I only have to make a couple more minor modifications so that they have a really decent amount of wiggle to them. I want them to mostly hold their shape and not flop too far forward. This head is also a little bit big on me because it's for my sister.